Today we will be reviewing Chapter 6 and the first section, and so this chapter is split up into 3 sections. To begin with, the textbook definition of memory includes our ability to store and retrieve any piece of information over time, which may include verbalizations such as my lecture that's going on right now, visual information such as the PowerPoint presentation that we're using. And there are 3 key functions of memory, and these include encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is a process by which we transform what we perceive, think, or feel into an enduring memory. Storage is the process of maintaining that information in our memory over time. And lastly, retrieval, as you would guess by the name, is a process of bringing that information to mind that has been previously encoded and stored. And so an example of this process is what you're doing now. So during this lecture, you're listening, you're taking notes, you're thinking about how this information is related to you, how have you experienced what I'm talking about in your past. So these are all examples of encoding information into memory. When you read the textbook and your notes and rehearse the information that you learn from class and from lecture, you're working on your storage. And during a test, you must remember all of this information that you've been taught and that you have been rehearsing, and that is called the act of retrieval. And so here, specifically, when we're speaking on the process of encoding, we may encode information 3 different ways. And the first is elaborative encoding, and this is the process of actively relating new information to knowledge that you already have. So remember the meanings of words better than how a word looks or sounds. And when you're studying for the next exam, for example, a useful strategy for memorizing information would be to relate important terms to your past experiences and knowledge. So one example of this is if you're memorizing the term informed consent from the last section or the last test that we had. And you just completed a 2-hour research study where they sat you down, they explained informed consent to you, they had you read the form, and then you signed the informed consent. You would be better able to connect your experience with the definition of the word and retrieve that information at a later date when you were taking the exam. So next, after encoding, or not after encoding, but while you're encoding, you may be using visual imagery encoding. So this is a process of storing new information by converting it into mental pictures. And so why does visual imagery even work? So why is that even useful? Why is that a useful type of encoding? When we relate new memories that we already have by visually thinking about any single piece of information that you have, you're essentially assigning it 2 mental placeholders, one for visual and the other for verbal type of memory. So you're basically putting them 2 places within your brain, and when we do encode information in 2 places, then it's easier to retrieve at a later date. So one way of doing this is to take a mental walk through a list or a room, anything that's related to that. So one example that I like to use is that when I'm making my shopping list for Walmart and I want to memorize and I don't want to forget any of the anything that's on my list, I organize my sections by how Walmart is organized. And so I may list the fresh fruits and vegetables, then I'll go through the frozen food, canned food, and then the list just goes on because I can take this mental walk through Walmart because I've been there so many times, and I can pair that with a list of what I need from Walmart. So by using visual imagery encoding, we actually activate regions in the occipital lobe, which, as we learned, is the visual cortex. So lastly, the encoding, the last type of encoding that we'll talk about is organizational encoding. And this is the act of categorizing information by noticing how 2 pieces of information are related. And with this, we may organize concepts into hierarchies. So this is one effective form of organizational encoding within a group of items. Noticing how the items are different is another effective form of organizational encoding. We do this by observing how things fit together and how they differ from one another. So one example of organizational encoding is this class, how this class and how the class textbook is arranged. So the psychology textbook is well organized and well written. The textbook gives great examples and details about many terms and theories, and the chapters themselves are organized into specific categories in order to help us process this information more clearly. And so by that, it is helping us to encode with this type of organizational encoding that just helps us to learn this information easier and to memorize it better. And so here we see we have an example of a natural organizational hierarchy that we have in the world around us, that we already have in our memory and our brain, that we may not have even realized that we have this natural hierarchy. So it's broken down into animals and then birds and mammals and so forth. When we talk about maintaining memories over time, now that we have a basic understanding of how we memorize information or how that's encoded on our memory, the next step is to discuss how we maintain those memories over time. So to preface this discussion, there are 3 different types of memory, and they are defined by how long do we actually hold on to that information, and this is how we maintain memories over time. And so the first type of memory is called sensory memory. And sensory memory is a storage that holds sensory information just for a few seconds or less. And there are 2 kinds of sensory memory, and these include iconic memory and echoic memory. So iconic memory is used for visual information that is held for typically a second or less, and echoic memory is used for auditory information that decays usually in about 5 seconds. So iconic, visual, icon or iconic for your eyes, it's for visual information. Echoic, if you think of an echo, this is important for auditory information. So significantly, pieces of information that don't trigger a past experience or some previous knowledge that we already have in our memory, or is not actively rehearsed in our mind, like a definition of a word, are subject to this type of sensory memory. And so every minute of the day, if you think about it, our brains are just bombarded with information from the environment around us. And most of the information that our brain is receiving from our environment is not really needed for what we are doing at that time. So any task that we're doing, and it's really not needed for our survival. And so these pieces of information that are not needed are basically just disregarded within a few seconds. And so we don't really need that information, so it goes away, essentially. And the second type of memory is short-term memory. So our short-term memory is a place where non-sensory information is kept for more than a few seconds, but less than a minute. And what we see with this is it's usually no more than 20 seconds, but the short-term memory fades rapidly in accuracy and our overall ability to recall that information. So techniques used to keep information in our short-term memory, and eventually, if we practice it enough over and over, it's eventually encoded onto our long-term memory. These techniques include rehearsal and chunking. And so rehearsal gives us longer shelf life because we keep repeating that information over and over again. And chunking allows us to take information and break it down into easier parts to memorize. And so here we have one example of chunking. And if I were to read off this long string of numbers and show you this slide, one technique that we may employ to help keep these numbers in our memory include chunking these numbers like a phone number. So we chunk them into a smaller piece of information so that we can remember the whole string of numbers. So as we see here, We're so accustomed to using phone numbers and area codes that when we see that string of numbers in that first slide, our brain may have automatically chunked them into 3s and 4s. And so since we're already primed to see this string of numbers as a phone number, we're able to chunk them in those 3s and 4s and memorize that information quicker and faster, or quicker and actually keep that information longer. And then also, in addition to that, when we do talk about maintaining these memories over time and talking about short-term memory, as we learned in the first chapter, we're only able to memorize about 7, give or take 2 pieces of information on our short-term memory. And this is because it's limited by capacity, so how much it can hold, again, that 7, give or take 2, and it's limited by how long can we actually keep that information in our memory. And so if you remember just from a couple of slides ago, I talked about that short-term memory only holds information up to a minute. Here, when we're actively attempting to rehearse information or actively using information from our memory, we're using our working memory. And so working memory is this component that is essentially a structure that makes up our short-term memory. And so with working memory, it's the central hub for our memory, if we think about it that way. It's responsible for complex cognitive processes such as planning, paying attention, problem solving, verbal reasoning, inhibition, mental flexibility, all of these kind of these higher complex order functioning for us. And interestingly, with working memory, researchers have demonstrated that individuals with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have significant difficulty with their working memory. And so this makes sense because individuals that have been diagnosed with ADHD, depending on their subtype, whether that's inattentive or hyperactive or combined type, often have difficulties with paying attention, sitting still, focusing on one task at one time, and being impulsive. And so they have these difficulties with these type of executive functions that we see within the working memory. Here we have long-term memory. So this is the third and last memory system. And long-term memory holds information for hours, days, weeks, or years, and really we do not know if it even has a capacity. So when we talk about long-term memory, there's no known capacity for what it can actually hold and how long can we keep that memory. So long-term memory involves semantic type encoding, which allows for longer storage. And so semantic encoding allows for more forms of helping us to remember pieces of information, and we can draw on the meaning on the event, which helps to ingrain that information on our memory. And so one example is that even after 50 years of graduation, people can recognize about 90% of their classmates. And so it's not only envisioning what their classmate looked like back when 50 years ago, but it was more of maybe they were your best friend in 9th grade or they were your enemy in 5th grade. All these different types of memory come together to really ingrain that on an individual's long-term memory. So here we see the flow through our memory system when our brain senses any type of information or perceives anything that's going on in our environment. So while you're listening to this lecture, if you're not actively attending to what I'm saying by writing notes or thinking about the information that I'm presenting, you'll miss encoding this information onto your memory. So we have a sensory input where you're hearing me talk. It goes, you hear it, it goes through your sensory memory. If you're not attending, again, like I said, to this lecture, thinking about what I'm saying, writing notes, then that information is automatically lost. It isn't encoded in your memory. But if you are writing notes, thinking about what I'm saying, paying attention, and you're actively engaged with this lecture, that information then goes into your short-term memory. And if you actively rehearse it, then it keeps in your short-term memory. But if you really think about this information that I'm presenting, and if you think about things on a deeper level, then that's where we see it actually encoding on our long-term memory. And so with this, the information is eventually encoded on our long-term memory. And then, as we mentioned before, long-term memory, there's really no known capacity for that. So we can hold that information for a long time. And so with that, that really wraps up the first section of chapter 6 and talking about the different types of memory and what is the definition of memory.